Russian President Vladimir Putin announced Monday Russia would begin pulling the main part of its military forces from Syria. According to the Kremlin, President Putin called Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to inform him of the decision. The surprise announcement comes in the middle of a fragile ceasefire between President Bashar al-Assad's forces and rebel fighters. Foreign correspondent Holly Williams, who has reported extensively in Syria, joins us on set. And our foreign affairs correspondent, Margaret Brennan, joins us from the White House. Margaret, I want to start off with you. The White House has just released a statement. What did that statement say?
Well, President Obama did speak by phone with Vladimir Putin about what most diplomats I've spoken to today have told me was a surprise announcement by the Kremlin that they are drawing down forces. The White House, in its statement, described this as a partial withdrawal, but no one I've spoken to can actually substantiate that in terms of whether this means a total and complete halt to 5.5 months of Russian airstrikes, many of which have been taken against the U.S.-backed Syrian opposition, and we haven't seen any numbers just yet in terms of really quantifying how big of a shift this is. But the initial read is a hopeful one that this looks like a positive development. And President Obama, when he spoke with Vladimir Putin, really tried to push the idea that this is not enough. You need to get your client, Bashar al-Assad, to also stop carrying out strikes. We saw some in the past few days on civilian areas, and also saying this needs to go a step further. The cessation of hostilities needs to turn into a real freeze in fighting and talk about a transition. No promises or timeline on that.
Yeah, a lot of the details, of course, people are still waiting for. But Margaret, if it turns out this is a withdrawal, how would that impact the overall fight against ISIS?
Well, the big question is what kind of military posture is Russia going to keep? In the statements we saw from the Kremlin, they're going to hold on to some military bases and they are going to keep some presence in country. What the U.S. has seen so far over the past few months is a gradual shift, that they are actually seeing Russia hit ISIS targets, something they weren't doing at the beginning of this campaign, according to the Pentagon, according to the State Department at least, and that they have seen a cessation of hostilities that the Russians appear to actually want to broker and maintain here. What that would mean is at least pausing or slowing or freezing one front in this three-front war to possibly then refocus on ISIS, which at least the U.S. and Russia both agree on ISIS being a common threat. Whether this means that you can get any greater coordination to get Russia and the U.S. to coordinate on strikes more is unclear.
Holly, let me turn to you. You've spent time in Syria. If it turns out that Russia is withdrawing, how would that impact the balance of power on the ground there?
Well, and that is the really big question. Russia has several thousand troops in Syria. How many of them are actually going to leave? How many of its warplanes are actually going to leave? Will we see an end to Russian airstrikes, or will we see them solely focused on ISIS? Those are all unanswered questions. But if Russia indeed does gradually leave Syria, then that removes the crutch that has propped up the Syrian regime. And remember that Russia started its airstrikes last September when it seemed as if things were tipping against the regime in Syria. So that will remove that crutch that has helped stabilize things for the Syrian regime. But remember that the regime is still supported by Iran and by Shiite militias from several surrounding countries.
All right, turning to another story from the region. Kurdish forces have detained an apparent American ISIS defector as he tried to make his way back to Turkey.
Where are you from?
United States.
Kurdish officials have identified the 27-year-old as Virginia resident Muhammed Jamal. Video shows him surrendering to troops in northern Iraq. Margaret, what are U.S. authorities saying about him?
Well, they're pretty constrained in what they can officially say because they haven't had access to him just yet. He is in the possession of Kurdish authorities in their custody right now. And what they need to do is to get diplomats from that U.S. consulate in Erbil, in that northern part of Iraq, to get permission to go in and see him. You can imagine there's a lot of interest in debriefing him, finding out what he knows. On the diplomatic side of things, the question is what happens next. And from what I'm hearing so far, it sounds like Muhammed Jamal may not be coming back to the United States. He may actually face trial in Kurdistan, perhaps not face extradition to the U.S. So that question of where he ends up and what sentence he may face, the State Department said, you join a terrorist group, we still consider you a terrorist. His legal status sounds like, he's going to remain behind bars in Kurdistan and certainly get debriefed, but they have not said just yet what the plan is as far as whether he could provide usable intelligence or whether he is simply running from the battlefield.
Holly, what do we know about the circumstances of his surrender?
Well, we spoke with one of the Kurdish officers who said that he spoke with this US citizen shortly after he was taken into Kurdish custody. And I can tell you what he said to us. He said that Muhammed Jamal first appeared in no man's land near Sinjar yesterday evening. He was spotted by the Kurdish fighters. They apparently fired warning shots over his head, perhaps assuming that he was an ISIS suicide bomber or an ISIS fighter. And then early this morning, around 5 a.m. local time, he surrendered across the front line. Now, what that officer has told us is that he was carrying around $4,000 US dollars in cash, 3 telephones, a driving license, a credit card. And the fact that he was in possession of those things certainly suggested to the Kurdish troops that he was intentionally surrendering and trying to get out of the war zone.
Wow, a lot of questions raised by that. All right, we want to thank Margaret Brennan at the White House for us. Margaret, thank you. ISIS still controls a wide swath of Syria and Iraq, including Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. Many civilians are still trying to escape the militant group's wrath. Holly, while you were reporting there in northern Iraq, you recently got rare insight into what's happening in Mosul. Let's take a look at that.
It's close to midnight on the front line, just outside Mosul, and these Kurdish soldiers are hundreds of yards into no man's land.
So is someone coming?
Yes, and they are now coming.
They're not ISIS fighters, but a man and a teenage girl. The man strips to his underwear to be searched, guarded by the Kurdish soldiers, who fear he could be a suicide bomber. But these people have risked death to escape ISIS, walking for miles through the night, and they're finally allowed to cross through a trench and into safety. And then, one by one, come 12 more men, some of them handing over guns. It's an extraordinary sight, because very few people have managed to leave Mosul after ISIS began sealing it off, stopping civilians from fleeing and banning cell phones. Overcome with relief, these men wanted to tell us why they fled, but begged us to hide their identities to protect family members still living in Mosul. These are torture marks, said this man. They heated wire and used it to burn me. His only crime was smoking, illegal under ISIS and its harsh interpretation of Islamic law. This man said he saw another Mosul resident beheaded after being caught with a cell phone SIM card.
If they caught you escaping, what would have happened?
He told us 3 men were caught escaping just a few days ago, and ISIS hanged them in the street. They're a criminal gang, cried this man, and we've been surviving on water and bread.
Is there any sign that ISIS is getting weaker?
When they first came, they were tough, said this man, but now they can see that Mosul is turning against them. The men told us they plan to fight against ISIS themselves now they're free, and to smuggle their wives and children out of Mosul as soon as they can.
So, Holly, from people who have escaped, what is the feeling among those trapped in Mosul?
Well, very few people are escaping. We witnessed this handful of people crossing over the front line late at night. But from what they told us, it certainly seems as if more and more people inside Mosul are turning against ISIS, are growing angry and frustrated with their very strict interpretation of Islamic law. And what that could mean is that it's could be a little bit easier to retake Mosul when Iraqi ground forces eventually begin their offensive to recapture Iraq's second biggest city.
And do we have any kind of time frame on when that is that Iraqi forces could recapture Mosul?
No. Various different Iraqi officials have said that the offensive perhaps may begin this year. We know that Iraqi National Army troops are moving into an area south of Mosul, but there are nowhere near the number that would be needed to retake the city. The US has said that they would need around 20 or 30,000 troops. And one US intelligence official recently told Congress that he doesn't expect that Mosul will be recaptured until next year.
Wow. All right. Holly Williams, tremendous reporting. Thank you so much.